Now, thanks to constant improvements in technology, video games have advanced at light speed over the years. Instead of pixelated art, modern graphics are almost indistinguishable from reality, and rather than completing a game in one sitting, recent titles keep players entertained for months on end. And recent platformers, shoot-'em-ups, and open-world IPs look so magnificent that it's hard to believe that older games even kept our attention. But unfortunately, this has caused a bit of a problem. You see, Super Mario 64, Halo, and Tomb Raider were marvels back in their day, but they're maybe a bit clunky and blocky by today's standards, and because nostalgia is very powerful amongst gamers, studios are eager to remake classics like these. Now, some of these reimaginings are polished versions of the original with enhanced graphics and sharper textures, but others are recreated from the ground up. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 remakes that made video games perfect. Number 10. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. Now, I know that there's going to be a few of you out there that say that this is a remaster rather than a remake, but you've got to consider the facts here. It was two games combined together as one brand new package, and it included abilities from Pro Skater 2 in the first game, and there was tons of reimagining going on there, so you know what? We're counting it as a remake. And you know what? Against all odds, Vicarious Visions managed to pull it off. They provided us with a brilliant skating package. Now, obviously, Pro Skater 1 and 2's lighting, textures, character models, and environments were all spruced up. That was expected, but the developers knew that it wasn't the visuals that mattered, but the tricks. Thanks to the smooth controls, pulling off ollies, kick turns, and heel flips isn't just easier, but more satisfying. Because mechanics from later games have been implemented here, the player can perform moves which were absent from the original. Now, when a game is available on various systems, there's usually one weak link, but Pro Skater 1 and 2 is the exception to this rule, since every single port of this is top of the line. And because this Tony Hawk remake is currently available on 6 systems, now's the perfect time for the old and new fans to check it out. Number 9. Super Mario All-Stars. Now, Super Mario All-Stars consisted of a remastered version of Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3, and the Lost Levels, which was unreleased outside of Japan at the time. The gameplay was the same, but these 4 SNES titles stood out due to their vastly improved graphics and sound. Now, although video game remakes have been around since the 1980s, All-Stars was a game changer, since it demonstrated how advanced a next-gen console was compared to its predecessor. Rather than being a basic reskin, enemies and backgrounds were drastically touched up. And some sections included brand new animations, most notably during the Sorry Your Princess is in Another Castle segment of the original game. Also, All-Stars allowed the player to save their progress, which is a key component missing in the NES counterparts. Not only did this simple addition make the titles more enjoyable, it showed that remakes didn't have to be a bare minimum effort. Rather than trying to make a quick buck, Nintendo put a lot of care into this property, allowing it to stand the test of time. If Nintendo bungled Super Mario All-Stars, well, gamers might not have got to enjoy the surge of reboots of the last 30 years. Number 8. Oddworld New and Tasty. In Abe's Odyssey, our titular hero must save his fellow Mudokons whilst avoiding the nefarious Sligs and Gluckons. Abe has little means to defend himself, which forces him to rely on his brains to stay alive, and I mean that literally because he can possess other people. Now, this PS1 platformer may be a classic, but it clearly suffered from hardware limitations. When Abe moved to the edge of the screen, the camera shifted to the connecting section, resetting the previous area. If Abe moved to the next screen while being chased by a Slig, well, the enemy returned to its original position, putting our hero in the clear. Although this technique was convenient, it did feel a bit like cheating at times, since the player didn't actually have to rely on skill to outmaneuver baddies. Fortunately, the remake definitely changes things up, because Oddworld New and Tasty doesn't have a screen reset mechanic, since the camera consistently follows our stitch-mouthed hero. Rather than walking off screen to avoid enemy encounters, Abe must hide, jump out of reach, or climb to safety. Now, this alteration makes the gameplay much harder, but it also makes it more satisfying, since it teaches the player to use strategy rather than cheap tactics to advance. Even though this is the biggest change in the remake, it isn't the only one. The Sligs have less predictable movement patterns, meaning that the player must plan out every single action. And the main campaign is much longer, since there are 3 times more Mudokons to rescue. Although this might seem like a needless change to pad out the runtime, New and Tasty keeps things fresh by offering more diverse and creative methods to save Abe's friends. And most importantly, the controls actually actually worked this time around. Yeah, people often forget about that. Number 7. Metroid: Samus Returns. In 2004, Nintendo released a Metroid remake for the Game Boy Advance called Metroid Zero Mission. Even though it was a pretty straightforward revision of the original, Zero Mission sold over 500,000 units and was universally praised. As such, redoing Metroid 2 Samus Returns seemed like the most sensible course of action. But rather than rushing out a bare-bones remaster, Nintendo took their sweet time. 13 years, in fact, after Zero Mission, because that's when Samus Returns finally dropped on the 3DS. Although visual improvements were expected, nobody anticipated the developers to up their game this much. Simply put, everything in Samus Returns has been rehauled to the point where it feels like a brand new Metroid entry. It features updated 2.5D graphics, making the exploration feel more immersive. Samus can now aim at any angle and perform counterattacks, making the boss battles more engaging, especially with the new weaponry, enemies, and bosses. Although this installment is challenging, it's perfectly fair, since it allows casual players to utilize the aim assist mechanic. The beautiful soundtrack oozes in atmosphere, and that accentuates the already tense gameplay. All in all, Samus Returns isn't just a solid remake, but one of the best entries in the bounty hunting, alien blasting franchise. Number 6. POKÉMON HEARTGOLD and SOULSILVER. Now, POKÉMON Gold and Silver are regularly cited as the best entries in Nintendo's most lucrative franchise, and because of this, it was no surprise when the creators released dual remakes called POKÉMON HEARTGOld and SOULSILVER. Rather than re-releasing the same games with a dollop of fresh paint, the developers applied various features now deemed standard in the series. HEARTGOLD and SOULSILVER allows the first Pokémon in the trainer's party to follow them around in the overworld. Although Poké tracking and rock climb weren't implemented until later in the franchise, these features have been added, which makes it more fun to explore and catch different Pokémon. Plus, a few critters from Gen 1, 3, and 4 have been inserted because, hey, the more the merrier. The music quality has been greatly enhanced, although the player can switch to the chiptune music if they are feeling nostalgic. But you know what? The developers didn't just incorporate elements from later sequels and just leave it at that. There are dozens of little additions and improvements here. These two titles come with new items, expanded story arcs, and bonus minigames. HEARTGOLD and SOULSILVER also includes a pedometer which offers in-game rewards to the player by walking around with their pet. Even though Gold and Silver will always have a special place in gamers' hearts, HEARTGOLD and SOULSILVER surpassed it in every possible way. Number 5. Shadow of the Colossus. Now, some games are revered so highly it's easy to accept their flaws, no matter how blatant they are. Ocarina of Time's Water Temple absolutely sucked. BioShock's final boss was, well, a bit of a letdown, and Spider-Man's stealth sections, well, they probably need to go. And even the biggest admirers of Shadow of the Colossus know that there were issues with the climbing mechanics and the lagging. And considering the premise of this tragic tale is to scale frame rate eating golems, these issues stood out, well, kind of like a Colossus. Of course, Team Ico couldn't really be blamed since these problems stemmed from the PS2's hardware. That's why the 2018 remaster of the far more advanced PS4 had no such troubles. But it wasn't just the climbing and performance that improved here. The camera was less jittery this time around, which definitely made it easier to scale these towering behemoths. Although the original was shrouded in fog, it was done away with in this remake. Rather than letting this change show off visuals in the distance, this enhanced visibility highlighted how barren this world is, which amplifies the tension and depressing nature of the story. The lack of fog also allows the player to see the titular colossi more clearly, making them appear much more intimidating and much, much bigger. Number 4. The Final Fantasy VII Remake. Because Final Fantasy VII's remake was teased all the way back in 2005, it felt like Square Enix's most coveted project could not live up to expectations unless every aspect of the gameplay had been improved. And that's exactly what the developers did. All characters, no matter how minor, were drastically fleshed out. Each plot point was greatly expanded. The turn-based mechanics were back, but the combat required more strategy since it also took place in real time. And it goes without saying that the Final Fantasy VII Remake looks absolutely beautiful. But on the surface, there was still one problem. Because every story beat of Final Fantasy VII has been memorized by the Final Fantasy community, the remake would be devoid of any oomph if the narrative played out in the same way. After all, Aerith's death doesn't pack the same punch when you know it's coming. As a result, Square Enix performed an incredibly ballsy move by altering major aspects of the plot. Because of this, gamers have no idea how the story will play out in the upcoming follow-up, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. But one thing's for sure, and that's that if the sequel is as good as this first installment, well, fans will be smiling ear to ear. Number 3, Demon's Souls. Now, Demon's Souls has earned its place in gaming history since it kicked off the Souls-like subgenre, but when looking back, this dark fantasy feels like a prototype for the superior follow-up Dark Souls. Even though this From Software title is magnificent, its flaws are, well, definitely apparent. And since Hidetaka Miyazaki's work has advanced leaps and bounds over the years, it felt like Demon's Souls was in desperate need of renovation. That's why it was a pleasant surprise when Blue Point Games remade Demon's Souls as a PS5 launch title. And although the original's mechanics weren't always precise, this version had no issue thanks to the DualSense controller. The player has absolute control when performing parries, blocks, and attacks due to the haptic feedback feature. Also, rather than locking the player's rolling capabilities to just 4 directions, they can now tumble anywhere they please. It seems like a minor tweak, but it makes a massive difference when cornered by a brutal boss. Even though there are many other improvements, the loading times deserve special mention. In the original, the player had to gawk at the loading screen forever every time they died, which, trust me, happened a lot. Luckily, the waiting time in the PS5 version has been cut from minutes to seconds, allowing the player to jump right back into the action every time they receive a game over, which, as I've just mentioned, happened a lot. Number 2, the System Shock remake. Now, when it comes to System Shock, there's one thing above all else that fans will speak long into the night about, and that is the sheer gravitas and all-encompassing persona of Shodan. Without a doubt, Shodan is one of the greatest video game villains ever, and her routine taunts and barbs at the player stoke the fires within you to see her brought down. For years, fans have been clamoring for this epic villain to be given another turn in the sun, and thanks to the wondrous magicians over at Night Dive Studios, we now finally have that glorious return. The System Shock remake took solid gold and added diamonds to the top of it, as this is without a doubt one of the most immaculate remakes going, and I mean that in a very literal sense, because the changes made in the remake are superficial at best, with only small quality of life adjustments made. Now, this makes the project as faithful a remake as you could get, and as such captures the glory days of not only your memories of this title, but of the gaming industry's past. Sure, some of the mechanics might not cater to a younger audience, but doing so would have actually lessened the impact that System Shock had. This is a beautiful looking remake with a stalwart soul of iron, and is arguably the definitive way to enjoy System Shock. And number 1, Resident Evil 4. With Capcom set on remaking all the main Resident Evil entries, fans knew that the 4th entry would inevitably receive a do-over. Although Capcom knocked it out of the park with the first 3 installments, skepticism was understandable this time around. Resident Evil 4 isn't just the tantamount of the series, it's one of the greatest survival horrors ever. However, the remake demonstrated that there is always room for improvement. Firstly, those infernal quick-time events have been reduced significantly, the player no longer has to pause every time they want to change a weapon, the ability to parry chainsaws, crossbolts, and dynamite makes the already innovative combat even more refined. Fan favourite Louise has a bigger role to play, and Ashley is no longer depicted as an insufferable damsel. The game dials down the campy dialogue, boo, but definitely gets rid of some of the cheesier moments as well, yay, which ups the atmosphere and the scares as a result, even if we all miss the Salazar robot this time around. Initially, it seemed unlikely that Resident Evil 4's remake could equal its predecessor, but after seeing how many improvements this incarnation made, many fans wonder why they tolerated the flaws of the original in the first bloody place. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 remakes that made great video games perfect. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me over on Twitter and Instagram, where it's @RetroJ, but the O is a 0, or you can swing by the Future Games Show, where I do all of my regular gaming content going forward. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. Hope you're treating yourself well, my friend, because you know what? We can always dial up that perfection in our own lives by treating ourselves well. We deserve love, happiness, and success, and do not let anything or anyone else tell you otherwise. You are a massive ledge, and you deserve the best. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.